Alright, man, peace. You know, brothers, I'll never forget back in the early 90s when I first started to watch NBA basketball. Really, the only professional basketball player who would speak out about racial issues at the time, really because he didn't give a shit, was Charles Barkley. A lot of the things that he said were considered controversial back then, even though we look back now, and many of his other former star players who played alongside of him during that era, including Michael Jordan, most likely agreed with many of the things that Charles was saying, especially pertaining to this notion of an athlete being a role model, but they couldn't say it because they were already in too deep. The Magic Johnsons, the Michael Jordans, the Patrick Ewings, the Reggie Millers, the David Robinsons, they were already in too deep, and we were in the midst of the corporate era, where everyone was trying to make sure that they fulfilled the wishes and the whims of their sponsors, and they did not piss off any of the markets that they were trying to appeal to. Well, now it's 30 years later, and basically Charles Barkley is viewed as a quote-unquote sellout, or a quote-unquote coon, which is something that modern liberal blacks love to call so-called black people who do not agree with their white, Caucasian, liberal overlords. Please once again understand that the so-called woke Negro is only the remanifestation, the reincarnation of the house niggas of the 1860s who dwelled in the North and were sitting at the feet of the Enlightenment thinkers of the time, the Luciferians, the quote-unquote high-level Masons of the northern section of the United States back in the 1800s, the Harriet Tubmans, the Frederick Douglasses, so on and so forth. That's all these niggas are today. There's no new thing under the sun. Nothing at all. So their job is to try to convince you that they're actually revolutionary, and they're not. All they are lapdogs for Caucasian liberals. And the Caucasian liberal is nothing but a Marxist and a globalist. Please understand that what is occurring right now in America is an attempt at a regime change and an ideological shift over towards communism. And that is what the quote-unquote defund the police agenda is about. It has nothing to do with empowering so-called black people, particularly so-called black men. There's no demographic on the planet Earth that actually cares about the so-called black man. Even the vast majority of so-called black women do not care about the so-called black man. Their attitude is that they are their own demographic. The average so-called black woman believes that they are a member of their own demographic. And for the most part, the only so-called black male that the average so-called black female cares about is her son. Please keep that in mind. I know that that sounds harsh, but it is the truth. Now, are there exceptions to that rule? Are there so-called black females who love their boyfriends, their husbands, their fathers? Absolutely. But they come very few and far between. The vast majority of liberal black females today are masquerading as quote-unquote conscious black women. They're actually triple agents, and I covered this concept numerous times throughout my videos. The three alter egos of the modern day liberal black female, and 98% of these black females are liberal. Their three alter egos are the racialist, in which they act as if they care about the so-called quote-unquote black race, which doesn't exist, by the way. There's no such thing as a black race. But the racialist alter, in which they try to act as if they're racially or socially conscious. Then you have the globalist alter, which is the so-called modern liberal black female wanting to hold hands with everyone, acting as if she's cognizant of all the cultures across the world, as well as the LGBTQ. That's one of the main components of the globalist alter within the liberal black woman. They love homosexuals, lesbians, and transgenders, and they will attack any so-called black man who does not conform to that new understanding of sexuality and gender identity. But the number one alter of the liberal black female is the feminist alter. And if she can get the simp or female-minded so-called black man to believe that she actually is the person that she's trying to convince him that she is, that is when she'll try to inundate him with these feminist doctrines about how he should worship the woman, really the modern fleshly personification of the mother goddess. That's what feminism is about. Trying to reinvigorate the worship of the mother goddess, or the quote-unquote divine feminine, known in the ancient world as Aphrodite or Rhea or Cybele, Juno, Hera, so on and so forth, Isis or Set. The list goes on and on. Ishtar, Astarte, whatever term you want to use. Really just talking about Eve. And that is why the serpent told Adam and Eve that if they were to listen to him, they will become as gods. And that is what happened. These quote-unquote philosophies and ideologies that trickle down to today, The vast majority of these major religions are based in the worship of Adam and Eve as the first proverbial fleshly god and goddess on the planet. They were the first king and queen on the planet. They were set up by the Most High to rule over the other nations at the time, but they rebelled. But just getting back to the point of this video, please grasp and understand what the defund the police philosophy is about. It has nothing to do with freeing or liberating the so-called black man or the so-called black community. What it's actually about is a Trojan horse mechanism to take away any level of autonomy that the individual affluent citizen may have. They want to take away your guns, and they want to take away the police force, because for the most part, the police force and the National Guard are the only thing standing in between your ownership of property and the mob. We saw how they tried to advance the mob over the course of these so-called protests for George Floyd, and how many of them were starting to attack private property owners. You had that Caucasian couple, I believe, in St. Louis, Missouri, who felt compelled to defend their estate with their semi-automatic machine guns, and that became a big issue. Why is that? Because the liberal media is trying to empower the mob. Of course, you have China, who's acting as a foreign agent and influencer over many of these factions here in America. It's clear as day to see the Black Lesbians Matter movement. They're being funded by the Democratic Party, and in reverse, they're also funding the Democratic Party. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the Black Lesbians Matter movement and the Democratic Party. What do I mean by that? That they're funding one another. Basically, what that means is that whatever you're donating to the Black Lesbians Matter movement is going to the Democratic Party. And whenever the so-called Black Lesbians Matter movement needs funding in and of itself, they have high-level Democratic politicians who will reimburse them, who will make sure that they stay afloat, because their job is to act as an agent of chaos on the ground. The job of the media is to act as agents of chaos through the telecast, to reinforce to the people that what the Black Lesbians Matter movement is doing is correct, is upright, and no matter what you might think about it, and how they're disenfranchising people who own businesses and have private property and houses, no matter what you might think about that, they're okay. What the mob is doing and promoting anarchy is okay. And by the time you figure it out, America will have been translated over into a communist state. Communism is the preferred governmental system of the international bankers, because basically what it does is it tells the adherents to the commune that as long as you work and you donate all of your money to the powers that be and entrust them to divvy it out appropriately, you'll be doing your part for the overall system. You're not going to be better than anyone, and no one's going to be better than you. Therefore, what it is a loser's paradise. That's what a Marxist world is. It's a paradise for losers. Losers, by nature, have no ambition. They have no work ethic. So what they do is they look at those who do have ambition and goals and work ethic. They look at those people and they say to themselves, the reason why that person is where they are is because they got favorable treatment. Sometimes people do receive favorable treatment when they're able to advance in society, many times. But you cannot maintain who you are and where you're at without hard work and perseverance. So what socialism/Marxism does is it's going to even the playing field by pulling those who are high achievers down to the level of the loser. So now instead of pushing the loser to work harder and become a winner, they make the loser feel better about themselves, which is why, if you pay very close attention, the mainstream media is constantly trying to encourage everyone to be more, quote unquote, empathetic and sensitive to people who are mentally fragile or weak, as opposed to taking those people to the side and working with them as individuals. Now they're trying to condition mainstream society to view those who are mentally weak as people who we should be focusing on as a collective, diverting our attention away from being goal-oriented, when the opposite should be the modus operandi. We should be focusing on these people who are mentally fragile to build them up, as opposed to taking the people who are mentally strong and trying to get them to become overly sensitive towards those who are mentally weak. That's why you have specialists. But anyway, just getting back to the point, that is what the agenda of defund the police is about. It has nothing to do with stopping police brutality against so-called black men. And that's why you'll notice that Colin Kaepernick, he loves to speak out about, quote unquote, defunding the police. He is a Marxist/communist. That's what he is. You'll also notice that super liberals are normally people who were never raised in the environments that they're speaking about. Colin Kaepernick, and I suspect even this person here, Renee Montgomery, were not raised in impoverished environments, the same impoverished environments that they allege to be trying to save. So they don't grasp the impact of taking away the police and what it would have on those environments because they're so busy trying to quote unquote save the world. But anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in. We're going to see what Charles Barkley has to say. And please keep in mind that Charles Barkley was raised in the projects of Alabama, so he knows what poverty is really about.
Moving on, the world, the country still talking about the Breonna Taylor situation in Louisville, Kentucky.
I'll be covering Breonna Taylor from both a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional perspective in other videos. But please keep in mind, brothers, please keep in mind that when you decide to initiate relationships with these modern liberal females, always understand that 99 times out of 100, they're just coming out of a relationship with someone else. That person may still be in the picture. And if that person is a criminal, whatever lifestyle she lived with that person is going to trickle down towards you.
The debate is even raging even hotter now because last night...
These are Caucasian losers. These people here don't give a shit about no damn Breonna Taylor. They just have nothing else better to do with their time and with their day. If they're not outside protesting, they're sitting at home, smoking up as much weed as possible and injecting themselves with as much heroin as they can afford. They don't give a flying fuck about the so-called black community. And if you let these people around your children, they're going to spend the vast majority of the time trying to teach your son why it's okay for him to put on a dress.
Inside the NBA, Renee, Charles Barkley made some controversial comments, and there are people on both sides of this argument who feel very strongly about this issue. So before we get into it, let's refresh everybody's memory on just what Charles Barkley said last night about the Breonna Taylor situation, and specifically about policing in America.
I hear these fools on TV talking about defund the police and things like that. We need police reform and prison reform and things like that. Because you know who ain't going to defund the cops? White neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods.
In other words, what Charles is saying is that the so-called black community is getting taken for a ride by the globalist Marxist factions. Now, don't get it twisted. He probably does not understand it to that degree to express it in the way that I stated it. But that's what he's saying in a roundabout way. All of these protests are only going to lead to the further disenfranchisement and degradation of the so-called black community because these affluent Caucasian communities are going to operate according to a paradigm of order, not the promotion of further chaos in your community, which is going to lead nowhere. The so-called black man is never told that he has to restore his relationship with the Most High in the spirit of truth. That is where order is going to flow from. And thereafter, your life is going to start to flourish because you're going to understand who to cut out of your life and who to allow to remain in your life. And believe me, by the time you start to set your life in order, you're going to find that the vast majority of people do not deserve to be involved in your life. And once you start to scrutinize yourself in that way, things start to become far clearer.
So that notion they keep saying that, I'm like, wait a minute, we just gonna leave, who are black people supposed to call? Ghostbusters when we have crime in our neighborhoods?
No, sir. You're supposed to call a group of women and homosexual men who are going to come to your apartment and do an investigation with a magnifying glass, like a bunch of weirdo Sherlock Holmeses. That's what you're supposed to do. This is after they've stripped you of your gun rights. Then when they come into your home, they can evaluate why you have so many nice things and then report you to one of their comrades so that they can come and take your shit and everybody can live more equally.
We need police reform. But like I say, white people, especially rich white people, they're always going to have cops. So we need to stop that defund or abolish the cops.
And beyond that, you know who else is always going to have cops and security? The same super liberal politicians that are advocating for police to be removed from communities of color. Charlatans like AOC, who walks around with armed guards. Noah asked that witch this basic question. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if you're so much against the police force and then being supposedly an oppressive faction, why is it that you have so many armed security guards? Why is it that the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, also has armed security guards? If there's so much against gun ownership and police forces, could it be that they want to be the only ones who have the guns, so that once you're stripped of having any form of self-defense, they no longer have to ask you to do something, they now can tell you to do something? Could that be it?
Of course, many people have said abolish the police or defund the police. Some people have said Colin Kaepernick, probably the highest profile, definitely the highest profile athlete.
The highest profile idiot until LeBron James. But I've yet to hear LeBron say defund the police yet. I'm not quite sure if he's made that explicit statement as of yet. But I'm pretty sure that if his overlords, if his handlers tell him to do so, he'll do it.
So I guess, Renee, I'd love to hear your opinion on what Charles Barkley said last night.
Yeah, I think, the point is people are so frustrated with how policing is being done that they're...
Are people really frustrated with how policing is being done, or are they frustrated with what they're constantly seeing on social media and the images that are constantly being conveyed to them on mainstream liberal television? Because we have to separate the two. And that's where a lot of the obfuscation comes in. That's where a lot of the blurring comes in. People like Renee Montgomery have a very difficult time differentiating between the same image that she's being inundated with on social media like IG and Facebook, as opposed to what's actually occurring on an everyday basis and what really is affecting the so-called black community. The number one thing affecting the so-called black community is the so-called black man has no idea who he actually is and where he comes from. And right behind that is the liberal black woman constantly trying to be a source of confusion within the household. That is, until she kicks the man out of the household. Those are the two major issues right now, not the police force.
Let's get rid of it. Like, I think that the point...
That's normal liberal black female rationalization. I'm so frustrated. Let's just get rid of it. That's because they have no real cognitive function. No problem solving skills. So whenever things get too rough, just quit.
Is that people feel like there's no coming back from policing. And
which people feel that way? Are you talking about the woke contingent or people in general? Renee Montgomery, I would hate to see you walking down a lonely street at 12:30 in the morning by yourself, being followed by a man 6'3", 230 pounds. I wonder what you would do. I wonder who you would call. Would you dare to call that oppressive police force, that same police force that has always, at least in the last 40 years, if you count that as always, been a very close friend to the liberal black woman? I promise you that for every so-called black man who's been killed by the police for a crime he didn't do, there have been 1,000 black men who've been removed from their homes at the behest of a black woman calling the cops on them. Many times just for a simple argument. So this notion that the so-called black woman is the least protected, I have no idea what they're talking about. The so-called liberal black woman especially has an entire police force behind her, and always has had an entire police force behind her. Always. Now, do you have the Sandra Blands and the Breonna Taylors that get killed by the police every once in a while? Yes. Those are 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 so-called black women out of 15 million in the United States. So miss me with all that bullshit. The judicial system, the police force have always been behind the so-called black woman, at least since the black female feminist movement.
Feel like there's no correcting the culture because it's so ingrained. And so those same...
Can we correct the culture in the WNBA? Can that culture be corrected? Because according to you, when things are not transpiring appropriately, the culture needs to be corrected or it should be done away with. Well, the WNBA has been in existence for 25 years and their ratings are still in the basement. So either we have to change the culture of the WNBA or we have to get rid of it. And we know the culture of the WNBA is what? Lesbianism. So either we have to get rid of that culture or we get rid of that league. You know, the thing about the liberal female is that they speak within a vacuum. That's why they do not make appropriate leaders, because a leader has to be cognizant of everything that they say and how it's going to affect everyone else. And also, if their words were reflected back upon them, or if their words or their sentiments were used in another situation, Would they be consistent? Is there consistency there? Because that's what a leader needs. You cannot change your evaluations and your judgments based on individual situations if they fall into the same category. Now, you do have to evaluate individual situations individually, but there should be a framework that you set up for consistency so that people feel like you're impartial. Are liberal females capable of being impartial? I don't think so.
Are the ones that are screaming, just abolish it, defund it. By the way, defund doesn't mean take all the money from policing. It says, and some people mean take some of the money, use it for other things. Yeah. But when you look around as a black community, while I understand what they're saying in a sense of how can we get results without basically starting over, basically like running it to the ground and starting it all over.
Right, but what exactly would that solve? Would that make the so-called black community better? Would that raise the graduation rates within the so-called black community? Would that lower the rates of single motherhood within the so-called black community? Would that lower the rates of incarceration within the so-called black community if you totally revamped the police force? And in the midst of you revamping the police force, is that going to stop the drug dealing? Oh, I know. We're going to make drug dealing legal because that's the real issue. It's not that too many crimes are being committed and people are trying to seek sustenance in chemicals because there's a dearth of actual spiritual substance within them. The real problem is that there are just too many cops out here arresting people. So, let's get rid of the cops. Let's decriminalize everything, and then let's see what happens after that.
That's what people mean, because the culture is so heavy. When you look at policing and you look at the culture, it's like, where do we even start with correcting it? As we all know, Babcock,
Nothing against that chick, Breonna Taylor, but you could tell she was all over the damn place, man. You could tell she was all over the place.
Pro law enforcement, so there are good cops. I know there's good cops, but where do you start when the good cops aren't doing anything about the bad cops?
Well, where do you start when the good so-called black women are not doing anything about the liberal black women? Where do you start when you have brothers who try to co-sign the criminal culture and don't demonize the gang members and the drug dealers in the so-called black community, as opposed to extolling them? We still listen to music like Biggie Small's 10 Crack Commandments, right? We listen to him bragging about raping young girls like he did on the song Dead Wrong. Is that okay? I have no problem with revamping things, but we have to start all the way from the foundation. We can't just point all the blame at the constructs of this society, because really what we're saying is once we can recalibrate or re-engineer the so-called white man, that's going to make everything better. What that really translates to is if we can force white people to love us, that's going to make us feel better about ourselves. And that's not going to work, because really all you're acknowledging is that the so-called Caucasian man and woman are your gods.
And where do you start when the law allows things to go? Like, there's a lot of times we ask questions, well, how does that even make sense? And everyone's kind of like, I don't really know. Where do you start? So
if you don't know, why you're speaking? If you don't know, why are you speaking? This is what I'm speaking about, brothers, when I talk about the liberal black female. They put a microphone in front of her and expect her to make these statements or answer these questions with any form of depth, and that's not what they were created for. The woman is beautiful, she's wonderful, she has her place, but her place is not to be answering three-dimensional questions involving society, but due to the fact that they've been trained to believe that not only are they equal to men, but that they're superior, particularly to so-called black men. They wouldn't even feel comfortable sitting back and allowing the so-called black man to be the agent of change for positive change in the so-called black community, because they have so much vitriol towards the so-called black man that they try to act like they don't have, and they hide behind this fake wokeness and this fake racial consciousness that's very transparent and bullshit.
While I understand that we do need policing, but we need policing to be completely overhauled, and it needs to be better.
Yeah, I think that's a good point what you said. And I don't know any other way to interpret what Colin Kaepernick said besides getting rid of police. And I personally believe that would be disastrous. And
Colin Kaepernick is a communist. Once again, the reason why Colin Kaepernick started his protest back in 2016 was so that he could be the initiator of a conversion within the NFL to cultural Marxism. And from there, the NFL could be used as an agent of change to bring cultural Marxism towards the population at large within America. This is something that they've pretty much been successful with in the NBA. The Black Lesbians Matter tournament that we just had here in the bubble in Orlando, Florida. What that basically was a sanctioned NBA AAU tournament to promote Marxism. That's all it was really about. And that's why the Black Lives Matter logo was on the floor. You only put a logo on the floor if that's a sponsor. They didn't put that shit on the floor because they felt like putting it down there. They put it down there because the Democratic Party and the Black Lesbians Matter movement paid them to do that.
That the black community would probably feel it the most, and really all neighborhoods where there's crime, because there's plenty of white neighborhoods where there's a ton of crime. I think neighborhoods where crime rates are high, I think you would have crime exploding, and I think you'd have businesses leave the areas, jobs would be harder to find. So
and,
I think,
well, one more thing that you said, that so in those neighborhoods where crime rates are high, honestly, those people are probably saying abolish the police because...
No, they're not saying that. And that's how I know that you're not from the hood. Because people from the hood, they want the police there just like everyone else wants the police in their communities to keep them safe. So that's how I know Renee Montgomery is not from the hood. She's some chick from, from the country in Western Kentucky or wherever the hell she's from, who's trying to feel more woke and saying things totally out of sorts.
What are those neighborhoods sometimes? Like police, somebody could call the cops in certain areas. The cops might come an hour later for an emergency.
Yeah,
so
I hope that's not true. I mean,
No, that's true. Many times these so-called cops have a disregard for particular communities, but number one, that's because they feel disrespected by those communities. Number two, it's because you have a faction or a force that you call the police that's pretty much steeped in Caucasian idealism and is a projection of a Caucasian ran society. You cannot expect them to have the same level of urgency to save and protect a people who are, to be quite honest with you, contrary to them in every way. Spiritually, there's a resonance there where they understand that the so-called black man and woman are contrary to them. They're opposite. So no, they're not going to rush to assist us, especially in our dysfunction. We have to show that we can assist each other and ourselves and correct our own problems first before anyone else is going to be willing to help us.
Some neighborhoods get slow responses.
And what's interesting is that I'd say maybe like a decade or so ago, you had that group in Detroit who called themselves the 300. It was something like 300 black men who decided that they were going to clean up certain neighborhoods in Detroit. And don't you know, liberal black women are the ones who shut them down.
Then they need more money, because if you give less money equals less resources and then less policing. I think that's the debate that's happening here. If you take money away, does policing get worse? Is the answer actually be, and it might be a little counterintuitive, but is it actually to increase funding and to increase training so you have better, more highly trained police officers?
That's what we did here in Atlanta.
The real answer is that the so-called black man has to return to being the head of the household. And I'm sure that cats are going to say, well, that's easier said than done. The answer is this. Any female who does not believe that the man should be the head of the household is one that should not be available for procreation with. You have the power because you create the seed. Cats are getting frustrated when you're the one who has the creative powers. The power of creation is not in the woman. What she does is she gestates your seed. Life is in the seed, not in the soil. You plant the seed in the soil in order for the soil to do its job. But life dwells within the seed. It's nothing against the woman. Her role is crucial as well. But life is in the seed. And that's why you hear about women's biological clocks ticking. You never hear about a man's biological clock ticking, because the life is in the seed. You understand that? So if you're frustrated by, the overall culture that exists in modern day Western society, it's your option to choose what type of woman to procreate with. So the real issue is, how do we bring about a unifying force among so-called men of color so that we start making better decisions with who we procreate with? What you'll find is, once we start to do that and we hold the woman accountable for her buffoonery and her adherences to to ideologies and beliefs that are contrary to productivity within our community, they'll fall in line. The woman in general will fall in line, and if she won't, then they'll have to be ostracized. Simple as that. Good riddance.
A lot of people were upset with what we did in Atlanta because, you know, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, she's kind of known as like our mayor, kind of, and, you know, Keisha, you know, and so a lot of...
Absolutely. That's why Atlanta is so ass backwards, because once again, down there in that quote unquote black Mecca, they worship the divine feminine.
Upset that the police budget went up here in Atlanta, but she said that it went up because she wants a body cam on every cop so that there's accountability. So, you know, if the budget's going up for things like that, that's great. But yeah, there are, I mean, you can Google it. There are areas where police are slow to respond. So the people that feel like they're not getting any help from the police, of course they want to abolish it. They already feel like the police aren't helping anyway, and that when they do come to the areas that they're only causing more problems. So I think that it's, you know, I think policies need to change, and that there needs to be, the good guys got to stand up. I keep saying it, but people...
I have no problem with that, but that can be applied to every field. The good guys have to stand up everywhere. We have to stop glorifying criminals, which is what the so-called black community likes to do, whether we admit that, understand that, or not. We never call drug dealers or gang members coons. We never call females who run around aborting their fetuses coons. Never. If it's a so-called black man who votes Republican, he's a sellout and a coon. If it's a so-called black man who does not believe that a woman is above him, that he doesn't worship his mother appropriately or show her the proper level of respect or honor. There are these constant shaming tactics that are utilized towards particular so-called black people who do not fall in line with the regular and average dysfunction associated with quote-unquote black culture, which is the lowest level and the weakest culture on the planet Earth, which is why we're at the bottom. A lot of us disdain structure and order.
Thinking that there's no good guys, because no good guys are standing up. So if you are a cop and you're a good guy, stand up in these situations.
That's cool, Renee Montgomery. Keep that same energy when your lesbian sisters in the WNBA rant and rave about how they want to get married to one another, because what that's doing is that's stopping the production of more black babies to replenish a lot of the so-called black men who are being incarcerated. Keep that same energy.
Supposed to call Ghostbusters?
Chuck said, who they supposed to call? Ghostbusters? But anyway, peace.